welcome to Turn the Page, the official podcast of the Syosset Public Library.
This is Jessikah from Syosset Library's Turn the Page podcast, and I am here with my co-host today,
Jen. Hello.
And we are very excited to welcome our guest today, who wrote this really crazy, amazing book that blends so many things. Please introduce yourself and tell us the name of this book.
Hi, I'm Francesca May, and I'm the author of Wild and Wicked Things.
And they certainly are wild and wicked. So I have to say, reading the book and kind of reading about it, I knew that there was some Gatsby in it. And there is so much more than this being a retelling of The Great Gatsby. I mean, we have had a few recently, or a few, just like different perspectives. This is so much more. I don't even know where to begin.
Yeah, it's I would say it's more inspired by The Great Gatsby than a retelling of The Great Gatsby. I very affectionately like to say it is The Great Gatsby crossed with practical magic, because it's what would happen if you made Gatsby sapphic, gothic, and added some witches. So
yeah. It was funny because when I read it first, and then Jen grabbed the review copy after me. And I remember first I said, okay, so this is it's got shades of Gatsby, and it's not so much a retelling as it uses almost like archetypes and certain themes. And then as I went on reading it, I was like, oh, but it's also practical magic is there too, which both I believe have the connection in that the author is a Long Island person for practical magic, and The Great Gatsby, Fitzgerald was from around, or lived around here, and the West Egg and East Egg famously is supposedly 20 minutes from where we're recording. But throw in lesbian witches, you've got some great characters in this.
Absolutely. I mean, I think the fun thing about Gatsby and the fun thing about practical magic, the area where they intersect, is they tell stories about characters who are either experiencing awful things or have experienced awful things, and their responses to those awful things. And I think the difference between the two of them is that their reactions are obviously very different to those things. I think you can argue that the Gatsby characters are kind of awful people, whereas the practical magic kind of archetype builds on what happens if bad things happen to people who are trying to be good. And I tried to blend those two elements a lot in Wild and Wicked Things. So you have a real cross section of people. You've got some really awful characters. I'm going to name drop B here, who is the sort of supporting ex-best friend character, who I think sort of lines up quite a lot with the Daisy character in Gatsby. She genuinely is not a super nice person. She's quite selfish. She's very self-involved. But then you have other characters like our protagonist Annie, who genuinely wants to be a good person and is trying to be a good person, but she makes some very interesting decisions in pursuit of being a good person, which actually kind of makes you question her morality and makes herself question that as well. So it's definitely something I wanted to play with.
Something that I really enjoyed about these characters was the way that they related to their pasts, and to each other. So I thought it was super interesting how B really just disappears from Annie's life, and she finds her in this new place with a new identity and a whole new life, and how Annie kind of serves as a reminder of the past that she is trying to forget. And I'm wondering, if you could talk a little bit just about the dynamic between these characters.
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the main themes in Wild and Wicked Things is kind of reinvention, and it's this idea of people trying to become someone else. Only obviously we are all rooted to our past and our past experiences, and so the characters do interact with their past in different ways. B particularly is interesting because her idea is just to try and cut herself off dead from every element of her past, only she can't really disentangle herself from Annie because they've grown up in each other's pockets. You know, they grew up in Whitby, you know, it's relatively small. They have been best friends their entire lives. Their mothers are really close. And so although B really does want to distance herself from that life, she can't completely 100% cut herself off. And unfortunately, you could view that as being her downfall in some ways, although arguably not in other ways, because she is rather prone to making bad decisions anyway. But the thing with Annie is that she comes about her own growth as a character far more accidentally and maybe organically. She's not necessarily a brave person. She would love to be brave, and it's one of the things that she always really admired about B growing up. You know, B was the brave one. B was the one who came up with all the fun things that they were going to do and the soldiers they were going to go and hang out with on the pier and things like that, whereas Annie was always much more of a follower. But when her father dies and she ends up being summoned to his estate to kind of sort through his belongings, it's almost like the kick that she needs to push her out. And unfortunately, she brings with her a lot of baggage, and she brings it straight to B's door because B is already on the island. So it's a very interesting kind of way that they both treat their past. I think definitely B is more afraid of her past. Annie is more afraid of kind of what she would have become if she'd continued along those lines, whereas B just wants to cut it off completely and not think about it.
So there you have those great Gatsby themes again. When it comes to reinvention, you obviously with Gatsby, he's the one who has reinvented himself from Jacob Gatz to Jay Gatsby, who really doesn't exist as he would very much like to. And a lot of the characters here actually either have been reinvented by somebody else for certain reasons or are reinventing. I just kind of want to go back really quickly to the poem, though, that you use, and it sort of circulates throughout the story. And I believe it comes from The Great Gatsby. I had actually forgotten it before I started reading the book again, which is crazy because that's a book that I always kind of go back to. It was one that I really enjoyed when I was younger. And it almost, reading the poem, it is like a spell, which is perfect for this book about witches.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's a lot of elements in Gatsby that I wanted to draw on, particularly. I mean, so the poem is you know, it's used quite a lot in popular culture, and what I wanted to do was really dial up the witchiness of that, because I think actually Gatsby has a lot of that. I don't say occultism, but it's almost that verging on the morbid and that kind of curiosity of death and like negativity. And I think a lot of witchcraft focuses on the transcendence of that. So I thought it was really fun that actually going back and reading Gatsby again, you've got those elements already and you can just kind of dial them up already, like to 10,000. So yeah, it's definitely something that I wanted to play with. And I think crows particularly are super spooky. So not only that, but they're very intelligent, and there's that hidden intelligence. And I think that's the thing about Gatsby as well. And it's hopefully the thing that people will find in my book. The characters, you may not like them and you may not agree with their decisions, but they're coming from a place of kind of moral philosophy almost. I think every character in the book, even B, is very concerned with their own role and also the role that they play in other people's lives. So it is that kind of complexity, and I think that crows being so intelligent was something that I really wanted to bring in and kind of play with that a little bit. And particularly, you know, you've got the witchy element of kind of crows being familiars, so double whammy.
Yeah, I'd love to talk more about the crows, and in particular Crow Island, because as I was reading, I grew like just really enamored of this place. It sounded so fun and so mysterious. And I was wondering if it was a real place. And I did see some references to a Crow Island, but I wasn't sure if it was the same place that you were imagining, or if it was something that you drew from, or was this entirely an invention?
So it was entirely accidental, actually. It was, I basically knew that I set out wanting to use the Gatsby elements, but I wanted to make it my own. And part of that was bringing in kind of this cross section of Britishism as well. I didn't necessarily want to set it on mainland England because that just feels too traditionally like historical fiction. And I wanted to have that space to create this alternate reality. So I did want to create something completely new. And there is a myth in the book of how Crow Island became, which I had great fun with. But it was kind of more of a way for me to bring in the Americanisms and the Britishisms and mix them all up in one and have that kind of Gatsby element. Because when people think Gatsby, they often obviously think Prohibition era. And obviously in the UK, we did not have the same Prohibition era. It was not the same impact. Obviously we were bootlegging, but not in the same way. So yeah, I definitely wanted to kind of meld those two cultures as much as I possibly could.
Yeah, I really liked how you sort of answered the idea of what the prohibition was going to be in this story, and I don't want to talk too much about it. This story was just delicious. Everything about it was just so beautiful and so decadent, and I just loved the characters, the morally gray ones. As with the Tom character, though, he was, unsavory in his way, but there's more to it, I think, in this situation. But we have been talking a lot about this book, and we have not spoken about, is it Emmeline or Emmeline?
Emmeline, yes, my quintessential Gatsby. She's absolutely my favorite character in the whole book. I loved writing her point of view chapters more than any of the others because she is so bold and brave and brash, only she really does have a heart of fear, I think, at her center. She's worried about her family. She's got 2 adopted siblings, and she is doing her very best to care for them in the only way she knows how. And because of the way that she was raised and her role that she's played, in Crow Island, growing up and coming into her magic, selling magic is the only thing that she knows how to do. And unfortunately, the law is kind of against her. But she's definitely willing to take that if it means trying to protect her family and build a home for them. So I think she does have kind of a lot of Gatsby in her, but I like to think that I've given her more heart on the page than Gatsby has, I hope, because I wanted her to have that kind of multifaceted layer to her as well.
It's funny you say that because with a lot of these retellings that I've been reading, and again, I want to stress this is not a retelling. You will see the threads when they're there, but it is just so much its own thing. And that's not to knock any of the recent retellings that I've been reading because they're also fabulous. But just sort of looking at Gatsby from different retellings, I'm like, man, he's kind of like the friend zone guy, right? He's kind of like that guy who, the nice guy on the internet who's like, she put me in the friend zone for that Chad, Tom, to use the speak. And, like he was such a romantic hero. And I don't necessarily think that that's really what was, like what he was written as, but maybe, with our more modern eye, we can kind of see that from him. I remember I always felt very badly that he spent so much time trying to impress people who were awful, that he allowed himself to become awful and ultimately died for it. Spoiler alert, not for this book though. You'll have to read to find out what happens to Emmeline. But yeah, I really liked the departures so much.
Yeah, that's definitely, I think sometimes, because again, I have read lots of amazing retellings of Gatsby, and this is not really in the same vein at all. It's definitely more of a reimagining. And I think part of the fun for me was by looking at gender and the role that gender plays in Wild and Wicked Things, it does force Emmeline's character to grow and change differently than Gatsby would in a retelling. I think the fun element that I had definitely is Emmeline feels like she has been forced into a box her whole life, and Annie feels the same way, only Annie is definitely more controlled by society's conventions, whereas Emmeline has been allowed to step outside of that because of her exploration of magic and the way that she was raised. I don't know if it's necessarily bravery in that sense, more that she just has had the ability to do that and been given the space to do that, regardless of how hard she had to fight for it. There's definitely just more room for it. And Emmeline takes that with both hands and runs with it. And I think potentially, in today's world, Emmeline might explore more about gender and she might feel more non-binary perhaps. But because she hasn't got the language to really explore that, and she's still quite young, she's only in her 20s, I think that it's definitely a real grey area for her, and I think that makes her a really fascinating character because she has so much room for growth and so much more depth as a person, which I don't think you can get in the Gatsby retellings if you're trying to stay faithful to the source material. So
something that I love about Emmeline is that she is, in some ways that you discussed, and in other ways is like a boundary crosser, because she crosses the borders of legality. She defies gender norms and how she dresses. The way that she's described dressing reminded me a little bit of like Katharine Hepburn, who like refused to wear skirts and only wore slacks. And she crosses gender norms in other ways too. And I wonder if this was something that you envisioned as central to her identity.
Yeah, absolutely. The vision I've had of Emmeline from the beginning has always been crystal clear. I always knew exactly how she felt about a lot of things, and dresses was one of them. She would not be caught dead in a dress. And I definitely think that you're right, she does cross boundaries, and I think that makes her a very complex character. It meant that there were areas of her personality that I would like to explore more even. You only have so much space in a book to do that, and she's absolutely fascinating to me, just because she has so much depth of emotion, because she's not very good at showing that emotion, and she's not very good at explaining herself. For all her kind of helping other people, she's not very good at communicating with those closest to her because she's just afraid. And I think that it's like that dichotomy of the bravery and the fear all kind of mixed in, and a lot of it as well is when you look at the 1920s and you look at the role of women, there's a lot of that just fed into from the wartime era and the way that women kind of were treated, and they felt they had to be treated, and you just kind of it was a very complex era, I think, in terms of women's rights. So
yeah, and one of the things that I particularly liked about what drove Emmeline was her love for her family. She had connections to Isabel and Nathan, who were, I suppose, her almost like her foster siblings. They were all brought up together. And while she was taught power was also taken away from her, Isabel and Nathan, in many, many ways. And she had such a fierce protectiveness over them. And even though she did cross boundaries, she was very hesitant to cross certain boundaries with Annie, even though she noted a connection.
yeah, I mean, Emmeline, the fun thing about Emmeline and the thing that I love most about her is you can say what you want about her personality, but she loves fiercely and she is incredibly loyal, which I think is one of her better traits, to be honest. Nathan and Isabel, she will do anything to protect them, and that has been the role that she has had for as long as she has known them. It's very ingrained in who they are. She took a lot of the flack, shall we say, from the woman who adopted them and who sort of suggested that she would teach them more about their magic. Scylla collected orphans almost. I won't say any more than that, but I think that relationship then that develops between them is really, really interesting. And that means that Emmeline is indeed very cautious about her relationships with people outside of that. And in some respects, she has already made the mistake with B of letting someone in to their sort of private circle, their inner sanctum. Emmeline was trying to help in perhaps a very misguided way, but by letting B in, she has now brought down a lot of danger on her siblings and on herself, but primarily she considers it on her siblings, and so she is very, very wary of Annie. And I think that kind of that is the main reason that she's very wary, even though they do have this connection that begins to form very early on.
So I had a question about what was involved in translating the story from an American setting to an English setting, because something that I noted about Gatsby and about your book is that class is also very important, and it determines how people live and how they interact with others and how they're sorted into, society's categories. And I was wondering if you found that transplanting it to an English setting, you found that it took on any new context or any new meanings.
So I think that class is kind of unavoidable when you're writing, particularly when you're writing historical fiction with characters from differing class lines. You have to really consider the impact of that. I think that the lines in some senses have started to blur when you look at kind of the middle and lower classes, and then the middle and upper classes. And I think that particularly from like a British perspective, the interesting thing is how the war impacted us versus how the war impacted the Americans, because we, I think, had a much rougher time post World War I because we have played a bigger role, obviously, in the war. And I think that, in all situations, in all war, the people that get impacted the most, unfortunately, are the people who have the least amount of resources to start with. And so I did want to have a look at the way that the war would have impacted different people and different people from different areas. So Bea and Annie do not come from particularly well-off areas, although neither of them are what I would consider to be in poverty. Both of their parents own businesses, but Bea's mother definitely is struggling a lot more than Annie's mother is. And both of them have had to learn a lot since the deaths of the men in their lives. Bea lost an older brother, and he was kind of their mother's main breadwinner at that point, even though he was quite young. Whereas Annie and her mother have always had to be quite self-sufficient because Annie's father left when Annie was a baby. So yeah, it's definitely was something I was very conscious of as I was drafting. And then you've got kind of Emmeline and Crow Island, and I think you do need to, if you're going to go down the Gatsby route, you need to kind of display that wealth and show how the wealth impacts people. But obviously it's got that magical element to it, so people are using their wealth to buy freedom from the pain of the experiences they've had. So you end up with this kind of legality where faux magic is allowed to be used, but it has to be licensed, and it has to be just that, it has to be faked, and people are using it, to get kind of closure from the terrible things that have happened, the people that they've lost during the war. So yeah, the class element was actually the area that I found was impacted the most.
So I have to ask, the title, I was surprised where it came from. It came from another literary place. Were there any other things that you really wanted to weave in from other types of literature? Was there maybe like a trace of the Telltale Heart somewhere in here?
I honestly, titles was something that we played around with a lot, and this book has had a lot of titles over its time. I knew I wanted something in the beginning that would be both witchy and Gatsby, so it had to kind of denote the era and the decadence and this idea of excess, but it also had to have an element of that witchiness because I wanted people to know what they were getting when they saw the title. And so at various points it had slightly more witchy titles or slightly more Gatsby titles. And it was actually one of my editors that came up with Wild and Wicked Things. And I just stopped and I was like, number one, as a lifelong Wicked fan, this is fantastic, and I'm overjoyed that we have the word wicked in my title. But the idea that it's a Hemingway quote as well, it is just phenomenal to me because it just seems to encapsulate so perfectly the period. And the full quote itself is gorgeous. It's about doing wild and wicked things because you can't help them, and that in itself is a main theme in the book is whether or not you're a bad person if you do things that are bad without meaning to. So it honestly just hit the nail on the head in that one go.
Would you consider revisiting Crow Island?
I would love to revisit Crow Island. There was a character I already mentioned, Scylla, who is the adopted parents of, or the adopted parent of Emmeline and her siblings. If given any chance in the future, I would absolutely love to write her story because she is so fascinating. If you want to talk about morally grey characters, Scylla Delacroix is the pinnacle of morally grey. But I think it would be a very challenging book to write because I'd have to make her sympathetic.
So what other witchy type media or books do you enjoy? As somebody who enjoys them myself, and I know Jen does as well, I'm curious now.
I love so many. If it's witchy, I'm in for it. I grew up on a steady diet of Charmed. That is like my all-time favorite TV show. I still revisit it on the regular. But I also think that Wild and Wicked Things has kind of elements drawn from The Craft as well. It's got that darkness that a lot of witchy books kind of skirt around. I think sometimes witchy books can be quite contemporary and quite bubbly, but I did not want to shy away from the darkness in that. There was a book that I absolutely loved by Shay Earnshaw called The Wicked Deep, which I would recommend if you like YA witches. I love any witchy books, to be honest. I'm here for all of them. I've got so many. I've got a whole bookshelf full. Actually, there is a really good historical one, which is another YA called The Beast is an Animal, which I would recommend as well.
I'd like to talk a little bit about the magic itself in your book and how it functions, because something that I found really interesting was the when you talked about like the various materials and ingredients that are used in these magic spells. A lot of them are things that have been used for ages historically in either magic contexts or even like medicinal contexts, like if you go back to the Middle Ages. And I was wondering what kind of research you did to come up with the spells and the potions and all that.
So yeah, you're right. I wanted to draw on a lot of what I would consider to be traditional pagan medicine and traditional pagan witchcraft. And so, you know, I'm very into that sort of stuff anyway. I do like to collect crystals, and I've got a lot of books on herbal medicine. So it was kind of a love letter in itself. The book was to my love of those things anyway. But I do have a witchy shelf just full of all these different resources and guides, particularly the herbal medicine. I think that's really important because the way that they brew the Kazam does use herbs, and it's basically cocktails infused with herbal magic. So definitely it bridges that kind of gap between fantasy and, you know, the beliefs of pagan and Wicca. But I didn't want to be too faithful because I'm aware that obviously the magic that they use is very dark, and, you know, real pagan magic is not like that. So
this has been really cool. I loved the book. It was unique in every way. The cover is absolutely gorgeous.
They did such a good job with the cover. The whole design team were amazing. The book is honestly a thing of beauty. So yeah, it's gorgeous.
Well, thank you so much for joining us. This was Jessica with Syosset Libraries Turn the Page podcast. My co-host was
Jen. Goodbye.
And we were here with
Francesca May. Thank you so much, guys, for having me. It's been great.
And we are going to close this chapter of Turn the Page.
It's time to close this chapter of Turn the Page. Join us for the next episode.